that time, and learning the language was not much of a problem. I missed my formal education, stopped at 6th grade, and I was 16, so I started as well, I had 6 months of tutoring, but then I started as a sophomore, and oh yeah, and my math algebra, I struggled for a while, but by the time I graduated from boarding school, I was ready to go to college.
Very special day for you, and for me, and for Granada, because this has never happened here before. And we really want to be very respectful and welcoming, as I know you are, because if you weren't that way, I wouldn't have invited this wonderful person to be with us. Please don't eat right now, even though I know you're hungry. Okay, take the notebooks out if you don't have them out yet. Put the phones off, okay? And hoods down, hoods down. All right, are we ready to roll? Okay, what I'd like you to do is I'm going to introduce you to Mr. Bernie Rosner. And are we taping right now? Okay. This is Miss Samitis' 10th grade and senior satire collection of students. And we're doing this in conjunction with World War II studies and the Book of Night by Elie Wiesel and Cat's Cradle by Kurt Vonnegut for the seniors. And Mr. Bernie Rosner is the author of this wonderful, co-author of this wonderful book called An Uncommon Friendship, which he's going to actually donate to our school. And I think that's all I need to say, and we're going to take it away with a warm welcome, please, from Mr. Bernie Rosner.
Hi. Thanks to Ms. Samitis for inviting me. Thank you for taking the time to listen to me, and if you have any questions and time permits, I'd be very much looking forward to answer any questions you may have. Ms. Samitis already said that in some ways it's a special occasion, and it's certainly a special occasion for me to be able to talk to young people. It's special for at least 3 reasons. First, you have to remember that when I landed on the train platform of the Auschwitz concentration camp and went through the nightmare of the Holocaust, I was just 12 years old, a couple of years younger than most of you are now. For that reason, I feel that young people like you can relate more strongly to what I went through, and hopefully you can draw some inspiration and support from my story. Obviously, I hope that nothing remotely as bad that happened to me will ever happen to you, but there's always bumps in the road and facing crises and decisions. And again, I hope that my story will give you some inspiration to deal with those problems that at the time they seem overwhelming. Second, I was among the youngest persons to survive the Holocaust, and earlier this year I, quote, celebrated my 87th birthday. The obvious conclusion is that there are few living survivors left, and there will be fewer and fewer of them as time advances. This makes it, in my mind, a special occasion both for you and me. It's not very likely that too many students in the future will have a chance to hear the story of what happened during those terrible times from somebody who actually lived through them. But I believe that this is something special because it makes a big difference to read something out of a history book than having the story told by somebody who lived through it. The third special reason in my mind is you are the future. It's up up to be to you to hopefully make the world a better place and to do your best to make sure that the horrors of the Holocaust and the other acts of inhumanity, terror that we have unfortunately witnessed since then do not just keep repeating themselves over again. While the early part of my life was dominated by turmoil, upheaval, and trauma, most of the latter part of it was spent under slightly more benign conditions, practicing law in California. The fact that I chose the law as a career is due to a number of reasons, but there's little question in my mind that after witnessing the breakdown of the basic norms of civilized behavior and the repudiation of decency, tolerance, and humanity and dignity, I was strongly drawn to a profession which ideally at least holds forth the values that were so brutally trampled upon by the perpetrators of the Nazi atrocities. For almost 45 years following the war, I put the events and memories of that earlier period out of my mind. During those intervening years, I've heard and read about Holocaust survivors and even their children who would not talk or even think about the things that happened because the memories were too painful. I have to admit that this was not the case with me. I shut the past out simply because I did not consider it relevant. I was in a new country, starting a new life, and my focus has always been on the future, not the past. Then, starting about the mid-1980s, probably long before you guys were born, 40 years after the war, two things happened that changed my attitude. First, I came to realize that you can't chop your life up into little compartments and jettison those that you don't consider relevant. Your life is part of you, and all parts of your life is part of you, whether you like it or not. Second, as a representative of the Safeway supermarket chain for whom I worked and who was a major contributor, I attended the opening and dedication of the U.S. Memorial Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. in 1992. Has any of you visited the Holocaust Museum in Washington? You did? Yeah. While there, and as part of a tour, I was given access to archives, including the log of prisoners entering the Mauthausen concentration camp. As I stared at the microfiche, which is a photograph that we roll and see data, there was the following entry for September 19, 1944. Bernat Rosner, prisoner number 103705. As I looked at the banal bureaucratic notation, the floodgates of memory and emotion opened and overwhelmed me. In that regard, you must remember, there is not a picture, not a document, not any tangible thing that connects me to my former life. The upshot of these reflections and experience was the decision to tell my story. When I was ready to do so, a series of coincidences, which in their own way are as unique as any other aspect of my life, brought it about that I met and made friends with a man by the name of Fritz Tubak, whose background and history could not have been more different than mine. While I was a Jew and a survivor of Auschwitz, Fritz was a German Aryan raised in wartime Germany. His father was a Nazi, and Fritz himself, in his early youth, was a member of the Jungvolk, which was the Cub Scout equivalent of the Hitler Youth. By the time we met in the 1980s, we had both become Americans. We both accepted the principle that you are responsible for your own actions and not for those of your father or other members of your nation or race. Over the years, we formed a friendship, and we discovered that we both had fascinating stories to tell, and we decided to tell it together. The result was a book called An Uncommon Friendship. The reason for the name is rather obvious, which is the main reason why I am here today. The book had a fair degree of success, has been translated into German, Italian, and Dutch, and it is still being bought. And it's not an Oprah book by any means, but it has, over the last 20 plus years that's been out, it's sold about 50,000 to 70,000 copies. The rest of what I will say will consist mainly of telling you something about myself, where I came from, what I went through, and how I ended up where I did. I was born 87 years ago in a smallish town by the name of Tab in rural Hungary. For the first 12 years of my life, I had basically a normal and happy childhood. An important part of my personality and makeup was shaped by the rigor and discipline of a Jewish Orthodox religion and upbringing, and a sensitive and literate mother. Both of these influences imbued me with an abiding love for books and learning. Anti-Semitism, I take it you know what the term means, was certainly not unknown in Hungary, and it existed in a good measure in our village, going back as far as I can remember. It was institutional in terms of laws that restricted the freedom of Jews from practicing certain professions or owning land, and limiting the number of Jews who could be admitted to law, medical, journalism, and other professional schools. It was also personal in terms of Jews being held up to contempt, hostility, and bullying, not by any means by all of the population, but by a substantial segment of the community, many of whom were members of followers of the Hungarian version of the Nazi and other far right-wing parties. But this was not the virulent and deadly doctrine of extermination as practiced and preached by Hitler and his thugs, and the anti-Semitic undercurrents running through Hungarian political and cultural life did not significantly affect my basically happy and tranquil childhood. Obviously, there was a very different childhood than yours. There was, I think, 2 cars in the town. One belonged to the doctor and the other to the local landowner. Everybody either walked or drove wagons, but I never felt that there was something missing out of my life. All this changed with a dramatic suddenness on a very specific date, March 19, 1944, relatively late in the course of World War II. I remember the day very well. I was on my way home from a study session in preparation for my upcoming bar mitzvah when my neighbor woman asked me if I had heard the news. When I asked what news, she told me that the Germans had taken over the country and the government. The effect of the Nazi takeover on the Jews of Hungary were immediate and disastrous. I will limit my account to what happened to me, to my family, and to the Jewish community of Tub. Within days following the takeover, the stream of anti-Jewish edicts began. Jews could not travel without specific permission. Soon they could not travel at all. Prominent families in the community, as well as those suspected of, quote, subversive activities or associations, began to disappear. By mid-April, all Jews had to wear a prominent yellow star on their outer clothing. One of my memories from that is that night before this rule went into effect, my mother sitting in our living room sewing yellow stars on our sweaters and jackets on our outer clothing. By mid-April, all Jews had to wear prominent yellow stars. And by mid-May, all Jews were herded into a ghetto. My family was lucky in this respect. Our home was within the area that was designated as part of the ghetto. But our three-room home, instead of just housing my immediate family, also became home for numerous relatives, as I recall, between 16 to 18 in all, whose homes were outside the ghetto boundaries. The end of the Jewish community in Tub came during the latter part of June 1944. On 24 hours' notice, we were ordered to be ready for departure in front of our homes with no more than one suitcase per person. 3 images stand out for me from the day on which we were marched down the main street of Tub to the unused brickyard next to the railroad station. The first was the attitude and behavior of the non-Jewish inhabitants. A relatively small number of them stood on the sidewalk as we were herded by and made jeering comments like, "You Jews are finally getting what's coming to you." The great majority of downtown people simply retired into their homes, closed their shutters to shut out the sight of their fellow citizens being driven down the street like cattle. The second image was a stop on the way to the railroad station, at all places in a school, where I witnessed my mother's humiliation by being stripped naked and hand searched by a Nazi thugs. The third was the brickyard with only bare earthen floor for accommodations, where an elderly woman standing up to recite her Sabbath prayer was clubbed bloody and unconscious by one of the guards. Now, as my life in the concentration continued, there were worse things than that. But you got to imagine, put yourself in my place, a kid living basically a normal life, being steeped overnight in a nightmare like that. From Tub, we were shipped to a collection point about 50 miles away, where we were unloaded onto a large open field. There, we were joined by approximately 7,000 to 10,000 others collected from other ghettos in that part of Hungary. From there, during the first week of July of 1944, we were loaded into cattle cars, between 50 to 60 men, women, and children per car, headed for Auschwitz. We arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau on approximately July 7. I remember it was a Friday. By the time the sliding doors of the freight car, which remained locked mostly throughout the 5-day journey, was opened, there were at least a half a dozen corpses and near corpses in the car, and many more whose minds became unhinged. On the train platform at Auschwitz, there was chaos, brutality, and confusion. But my immediate family, my mother, my father, my kid brother, and I were still together. The first thing that happened as we stood there dazed was an order from the loudspeaker that those in charge of each cattle car, and my father was so designated, were to report to the authorities. So my father left us, and that was the last we saw of him. Next, an announcement was made that males and females should separate because showers would be given. By now, my mother was quite frightened and told my brother and me to stay with her. Being a 12-year-old, I told that I was not about to take a shower with a bunch of women. My mother did not argue with me, but left me with the admonition, whatever you do, make sure you stick with your little brother. With those words, she left us, and I never saw her again. Next, all the males were ordered to line up in a single file to be inspected by 2 SS officers. The officers looked at each person as he reached the head of the line, and those who looked able-bodied and fit to work were sent to the right. Those who looked too young, too old, or otherwise unfit to work were sent to the left. My brother, who was just over 10 years old, was in front of me in the line, and the SS officer, without hesitation, sent him to the left. Harking back to my mother's admonition, and without realizing the consequences of my action, I followed my brother to the left. I was about 3 steps past the SS officer when he reached down, grabbed me by the scruff of the neck, pulled me back, and shoved me over to the right. To this day, I do not know whether the Nazi thought I just might be fit to work and be put to work, or whether he was simply irritated at my having made my own decision. In any event, that shove from the left to the right made the difference on that day between my ending up in the gas chamber within the hour, and as the rest of my family did, and my surviving at least that initial screening. My ordeal obviously did not end with that fateful shove. Every day for the next 10 months, until my liberation by the Americans during the first week of May of 1945, was a battle for survival. That battle took several forms. At first in Auschwitz, it was a matter of trying to avoid being sent to the gas chambers. This was because even though I survived that initial screening, I kept flunking the physicals that the prisoners were subjected to in order to qualify for a permanent work assignment. By mid-September of 1944, I realized that most of those remaining in my barracks consisted of the old, the sick, and those like me, too young to be selected for work. While I didn't know the full horror of what was happening and the killing, the murders, I knew that that was not a good place to be. At that point, in a desperate move that is described in the book, I managed to get into a transport out of Auschwitz to the Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria. Ironically, Mauthausen is considered in the annals of the Holocaust as one of the most terrible of concentration camps. For me, it was a lifesaver because I know I could be worked to death, I could be beaten to death, but at least I would not be sent to the gas chamber unless I got sick. From then on, my battle of survival was mostly a matter of fighting and trying to survive hunger, cold, brutal beatings, overcrowding, unsanitary conditions, and almost every other privation known to mankind. To illustrate, let me give you a brief picture of a typical day at the Mauthausen concentration camp. I will start with bedtime in the evening. Our sleeping accommodations were triple-decker bunk beds, but instead of one person per bed, we were squeezed 3, sometimes 4 persons per bed. The result was horrible overcrowding, with people fighting for each inch of available space. There was no mattress on the beds, sometimes some filthy ground-up straw, often just wooden boards. One night, I offered a deal to my bunkmates. If they let me have the single blanket we were allotted, I would go down and sleep on the floor under the bed, and free up some space on the bunk. My offer was accepted, and that was a win-win situation in Mauthausen. We were woken up about 6:30 in the morning, mostly with shouts, but if the overseers thought we were not quick enough, then with clubs and beatings. Our barracks, housing about 100 men, had 2 faucets and 1 3-hole latrine for sanitation needs. By 7, we had to be outdoors, out the barracks, and line up for roll call. We had to stand and wait for the German officer to show up to receive the roll call and report from the barracks chief, who was a prisoner. Sometimes the German would not show up for an hour or more, and we had to stand there in rain or snow or bitter cold until he showed up and received the report. This was during the late fall and winter months, and we only had thin, striped prisoner uniforms for clothing. After roll call, we had breakfast, which consisted of a brown, lukewarm liquid they called coffee. After breakfast, the able-bodied prisoners were sent out to work detail. Since I was small and frail-looking, I generally was not picked to work. Instead, all of us who were not picked for work had to stay outside the often freezing cold. To ease our discomfort, we huddled against each other for body warmth. One amusement of the more brutal overseeing guards was to start beating the outer layer of this huddled mass with clubs and watch the whole group break into a stampede. In the course of one of these stampedes, my feet got trampled on, resulting in cold sores that never healed during my time in camps, and I still have the scars on my feet. For lunch, we were served a cup of gray, greasy liquid called soup. I hope I don't spoil your lunch. Made out of dried beets and floating maggots in the liquid. Our dinner consisted of a slice of bread with a square of margarine or scoop of jam. During my 10 months of imprisonment, I never had a glass of milk or a piece of fruit. The only exception was one day when we were carrying airplane parts in a public street, and a woman was walking ahead of us, eating an apple. She looked around furtively to see that there were no guards looking, and then threw the half-eaten apple on the ground. I was the lucky one who picked it up, took a bite, and then shared the spoils with my best friend. To add to our misery, the unsanitary conditions resulted in an enormous infestation of lice. We spent much of our days squirming and scratching, and our evenings trying to kill the vermin that were crawling on our clothing. A very large number of prisoners contracted typhus as a result of the lice, and many of them died of the disease. I too got sick, but fortunately the symptoms did not show up until I was liberated by the Americans in early May of 1945, and I was cared for and recovered in an American Army field hospital. When I woke up after several hours of lying unconscious, I was put on a scale, and at the age of 13, I weighed 26 kilos, or about 52 pounds. Following the war, there were many pictures in magazines and newsreels showing the cadaver-like creatures that emerged from the concentration camps upon liberation. I was one of them. With all the brutality and deprivation, there were instances of humanity and selflessness, sometimes from unexpected quarters. Let me give you 2 examples. The first involved a German soldier who was one of the guards when we were being moved from Auschwitz to Mauthausen. The journey was by train in a cattle car, but the conditions were not nearly as terrible as those on the trip to Auschwitz that I described earlier. There were about 30 male prisoners per car. We had adequate sanitation and water and meager but regular meals. The guard with his rifle was quartered with us in the cattle car. During the first day of the 3-day trip, he was distant and unfriendly. But by the second day, he unbent a little, and for some reason, he took a liking to me. By that evening, he offered me some morsels from his dinner, which of course was far superior to what the prisoners had to eat. Later that evening, he asked me to sing some songs that I remembered from my childhood. I felt that somehow in that cattle car, taking me to the next concentration camp, this German soldier and I had formed a bond. The second instance of some light in the dark days of my captivity involved my best friend and me. You could not possibly survive the physical and emotional trauma of the camps without a buddy system, a friend to lean on, give support to, and receive support from. In my case, I found a boy about my age in Mauthausen, the second camp I was in, and we both felt that we made a good fit. The name of this boy was Simcha, and there's a picture of the 2 of us in my book, which was taken shortly after the war. One night, in the middle of the winter, someone stole Simcha's shoes while we were sleeping. We basically kept our clothes on and used our shoes as a kind of a pillow. The shoes were not much. They were basically flip-flops with wooden soles, but they were all we had, and they were certainly better than nothing. So the following morning, Simcha had to walk barefoot through the snow and ice to the factory we were working in about a mile away. While at work, the thief, another bigger boy, came up to us and said, "Guess what? I found your shoes, and if you give me your day's ration of bread, you can have your shoes back." Simcha and I knew that he could not possibly survive without his shoes, and neither could he survive without his ration of bread. The only solution was to try to make it for the day with a half ration of bread for each of us, and to use the other half to retrieve his shoes. We did this without discussion or question. We both took it for granted that he would do the same for me if it was necessary. People sometimes ask me if there were any good days in the camps. I tell them it was the day that I saved my friend's life with a slice, half a slice of bread. A word about liberation. It happened on May 5, 1945, a couple of days before VE Day. We were in a makeshift camp as we were being driven in front ahead on foot ahead of the advancing Americans. For days before, we were hearing increasingly loudly artillery explosions that shook the ground. To add to our misery, the weather was terrible, and we were mired in freezing mud, both outside and inside our leaky and drafty barracks. About the middle of the afternoon, a prisoner rushed in to our barracks and yelled, "Hey, the guards are gone." That was the way we found out that we were liberated. What did we do then? Did we do a victory lap and celebrate? The answer is no. Instead, we rushed to the warehouse that stored the maggot-ridden ingredients of our daily soup, ripped open the sacks, and crammed handfuls of this noxious stuff into our mouths. I spent my first night of freedom lying on one of those sacks, trying to ignore the lice that were feasting on my flesh and hoping to get some sleep. Very briefly, I will tell you how I ended up where I am, how a chance encounter in the summer of 1945 changed and gave new direction to my life. By that time, with the war in Europe over, I was in a refugee camp in Italy, in the town of Modena. I was alone, just over 13 years old, ragged and hungry. There were thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, of kids like me hustling for an extra piece of bread, or if we were really lucky, some candy or piece of chewing gum. The only sources of those goodies was the American soldiers who were stationed next to our camp. So naturally, I spent much of my time hanging out there where the Americans were billeted. As I was standing there one day looking for a hustling opportunity, a Jeep drove up loaded with four GIs. You know, GIs are soldiers, and their duffel bags. I immediately ran up to the Jeep, headed for the nearest soldier, with in sign language offered my services as a porter. He smiled and pointed to one of the bags. The bag was almost as big as I was, and my employer later told me that all he could see was the bag and my two bare heels underneath pumping away with great energy. After I delivered his bag, to his room, the soldier gave me the chocolate bar, which I was obviously hoping was the reward for all this. And we attempted to make conversation. We discovered that only means of doing so was broken German. I told him about my situation, and he was visibly moved. For the next 5 days, he spent all of his free time after work taking me to movies and restaurants, treats that I've never had before. We also did a lot of walking and talking. There's a picture in the book of the two of us taken by a street photographer. 5 days after I met him, the soldier was transferred, and I was moved to a more humane orphanage than the dreary refugee camp. And I thought that this encounter with this GI was just a shining episode that added some light to my life. I was about a week in this orphanage when I had a dream. I don't remember the details, but I did remember that he was in it. The last night before he left, he gave me his address. So the dream kind of gave me a push to send him a note. So we started corresponding. This was in the fall of August of 1945, the end of World War II. The soldier was demobilized and was shipped back home. In November of that year, I got a letter from him saying that he couldn't get me out of my mind and what would happen to me. And he discussed it with his wife. He was married and had a little girl, and said that if I was willing, he would bring me to the United States and make me a member of his family. The decision was not that simple, because by then I'd formed bond and friendships with my friends, and most of the Jews who survived the Holocaust were trying to get to Palestine, which then later became Israel. But I did accept his kind offer, and I came to the United States on January 18, 1945, at the age about 2 weeks shy of my 16th birthday. When my friend Fritz and I embarked on our joint project, my intention was not to send a moral message. My intention was simply to tell my story, because I realized I had some obligations to fulfill. First and foremost was an obligation to my children. I had 3 boys who grew up in Orinda. As they grew up, they heard bits and pieces of the story, but never in a coherent and systematic way. More importantly, I subconsciously kept the pain and emotion out of what I told them, and I realize now that it was more to protect myself than protect them. I also felt an obligation to the family I lost. My father, my mother, my kid brother, and my extended family. The story of what happened in the Holocaust, of how the millions were murdered, has been told many times. But their story has never been told. I felt that they deserved that that be done, and it was up to me to do it. I also felt that my story was a good and fascinating yarn that was worth telling. With all the horror suffering, there were moments of tension, suspense, and adventure. The old truism that the truth is stranger than fiction is, I believe, applicable to several aspects of my story. But even though the story was not told to send a moral message, it does so nevertheless. I believe that the one that I believe is particularly relevant, the message I believe is particularly relevant, is the ability of two individuals who came from historically different beginnings to be able to surmount the walls that could have divided them, to look beyond the conventional mindset that could have made them, if not hate, at least distrust each other. Instead of doing so, they formed a friendship and told what I hope and I believe is a warm and inspiring story. Thank you. By the way, Eli Wiesel's story is very different, very same as mine. He was a couple of train loads either ahead of me or behind me on the way to Auschwitz that fateful spring of 1945. Now, do we have any time for questions?
Yes, we have almost a half an hour for questions and answers.
I'm sorry?
We have about half an hour.
Okay,
for questions and answers.
sure. Now, these are very insightful questions, and I think I covered most of them, but why don't you read them and I will.
Okay. All right. Now, ladies and gents, this is a collection of all of your questions, all right? And I gave them to Mr. Rosner prior to today. So the first one was, how old were you when it happened? And I think you told
I
that.
covered that.
Okay. And where did everyone go after the Holocaust?
Well, those who survived, and I'd say, well, in my family, there were 4 immediate family members, and I'm the only one who survived. I think that's probably a fairly good approximation of the number of people who perished, either in the gas chambers or through hunger, cold, beatings. And by then, when I first got there into Auschwitz, even though one of the crematoria belching this horrible black smoke, I just could not accept and believe that this thing was happening, that there were people who were making smoke. But I just didn't want to accept it. I remember the first month or so, I was making little notes. I borrowed a pencil and paper, asking people who went out to work detail to give it to my mother, my parents. Of course, they couldn't be found. But it took really till the end of the war, about a week after the war, when I was in this first refugee camp, when I met a man who lived in our village. And he had the job of actually herding the prisoners into the gas chambers. And he told me that he knew that my immediate family was there. So anyway, those who survived, certainly in my case and most cases, no place to go. There was no reason for me to go back to Hungary, and I was just in this refugee camp, and surviving. Obviously, a little, I didn't have to worry about being sent to the crematorium, but it was grim, and I told you the story of what happened in my case. I was very lucky. That GI and the duffel bag changed my life. And in many ways, what happened to me before, what happened that early part, given the war, given the politics, it was almost inevitable, and given my religion and race, it was almost inevitable that I ended up in Auschwitz. What was not inevitable is my being on that corner when the Jeep drew up with the duffel bag and the GI. These little things make a whole difference to your whole life.
And then one of the students asked, what was the scariest part? The scariest part.
Scariest. Well, I suppose, the scariest was about a month after we started in Auschwitz. The camp we were put in, was called Gypsy Camp because the Nazis also considered the Gypsies as an inferior race and basically were going to exterminate them. And about a week after we got there, when I first got there, at least half the barracks were occupied by the Gypsies. Then one day we were locked into our barracks, and all these people were in trucks. And I'll never forget a man standing on the truck and doing like this to his throat. And so that was, by then I started wondering what's going to happen. About a couple of weeks later, a couple of prisoner overseers came in with an SS man and took us all kids out of the barracks, kids between 14 to 16, and we were marched at the gate of the camp. And even though I didn't accept it, I thought, this is it. And I don't know what happened, but after about a half hour sitting around, maybe somebody else was using the gas chambers, I don't know, we were sent back to our barracks. It was pretty scary to know that your last moment is coming up.
And the profound question, how did you get through it?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I'm asked that question. And the answer is that I'm a survivor. I just put my head down and took everything that came my way, day to day, and continued holding on. You can call it either toughness, which is a complimentary word, or unfeeling and callous. The fact is, the difference between being tough and being callous is not a bright line. And I think any people, either emotionally or physically, who could not deal with this, just died of despair, died of hunger, died of disease. And it's just bullying it through and kind of dodging bullets, not quite that bad, pretty much ever since. And as I say, I don't think it was heroism, it was, and it's basically, you can call it, I was working with one of several young people who did essays, and they asked me, what is the basic message of your life? And of course, to survive, to show, to make friends, to make a constructive life. But this young girl asked me, what is the basic message? And just automatically I said, the invincibility of the human spirit. That's, I think, I hope, the message you take away.
They wanted to know also, how did you meet your German friend?
Well, that was here in Orinda. That happened 40 years, in the mid-1980s. We lived on Orinda, and I was widowed and remarried, not to the wonderful lady behind, but to another woman. I was in my early 50s, and I married this woman, and she graduated. She was an American and graduated from Cal, and within a couple of weeks after we were married, she was in a pharmacy line at Kaiser, and somebody came up and tapped her on the shoulder and said, "Aren't you Susan from Pacific Palisades?" So these two women recognized each other as classmates at Palisade High School down in Los Angeles, and they started, just in the pharmacy line, started exchanging stories of what happened in the 20 plus years. And my wife Susan said that she married a widower, and this lady said, "I married a widower too." And she had, Susan and I had 3 boys, and she was basically mothering my 2 boys. And Sally, her friend, said, I too have 2 children from my widowed husband. So they started coming, and then they asked, "Where do you live?" I said, "We live in Westminster Court," which was 2 blocks away from where we lived. When all these little details became known, they decided they should have a little more intimate lunch, and they met. And it's at that point when Susan, my ex-wife, told Sally that I was a Holocaust survivor, and she told Susan that her husband had a little different story. And the book, The Uncommon Friendship, starts out telling the story of the 2 bucks, Fritz and Sally, walking to our house for our first dinner together. We're living about a couple of blocks. So that's another interesting coincidence.
Then one question is, how hard was life after?
Well, people come into new surroundings, and I've heard people who went through almost as bad things as I did saying that it was just the new culture, the new setting was just a huge ordeal. Because of my personality, I guess, it was not an ordeal. I basically considered that I died and went to heaven. I will tell you one little story if there is still time. This was that I came in, my guardian, Charles Merrill, had me flown into New York at the age of when I came into this country. And he picked me up at what was now JFK, was called Idlewild, and he was part of a pretty prominent family, and he had a stepmother who lived in Manhattan. So the first night of my U.S. presence, I spent the night at her house. And this lady was a kind of a funky lady, and said, she had a general idea of my story, and said, "What would a kid like that want for breakfast?" And, you know, ham and eggs, bacon. She said, no. So when I came down for the breakfast, there was this large kind of bowl with a huge blob of ice of white substance. The only thing I saw in that big quantity being like that was lard, which was what they used for cooking. So I looked at it and I said, my God, the Americans have strange breakfast habit. And I said, I really am not very hungry. And she was kind of taken aback and said, why don't you taste it? I tasted it, and it was ice cream. And needless to say, the huge scoop disappeared very quickly. That's kind of a funny way of saying it, but I'm very adaptable. Language, by the time I started, I came at 16. I had private tutoring for about 6 months. Then I started as a sophomore in a boarding school, and by the time I graduated, I went to Cornell University and went to Harvard Law School. So afterwards, it came out okay. I guess that's the answer.
Sure. This question is, did people in the camps talk about Oscar Schindler?
No, I had no idea. Obviously, Arthur Schindler happened while people were in the camps. I first saw the movie. That's when it came out in the early 80s. He obviously was a unique man, and the picture that was made was dramatic. And I will have to say that that movie included a picture of the gate, the railroad station going through, that I went through. And I have seen pictures before, and even today, to this very day, when I see that tower and that gate, my blood runs cold and I shiver and racked with emotion.
One question is, did you ever see Hitler?
No, I didn't see Hitler, but the Nazi who was in charge particularly of the deportation and murdering Hungarian Jews was a name by the name of Adolf Eichmann. I don't know if any of you have heard of him. It was a very fascinating story about he got caught, he was taken prisoner by the Israelis a couple of years after the war. He was found. In any event, before going to the camps, I was in this ghetto, and I became a runner. I've always wanted to do something, and so I carried messages from the bureau, one official to another, and I was running down the street carrying a message when 4 jackbooted, uniformed officers, German officers, were on the street, and I have since read the books to know that in fact Adolf Eichmann visited the ghetto I was in. So I was running down the street, they stopped me, and he patted me on the back, on the top of the head, and said, Kleine Bube, which means little boy. So and since then, both from the pictures, and I described to Fritz the number of pips he had on his collar, there was no question it was Adolf Eichmann, who was the chief architect of the destruction of the Hungarian Jews.
How has this changed your view of people?
As I showed you, people come in all shades. And this German soldier who befriended me on the train, and other instances, not all people are bad, and most people are only good. There are some who are total good, some people are total bad. And I think that what the kind of culture, the kind of upbringing you have, the kind of life you live in, gives you some values of the things that I mentioned earlier in my talk about respect for people, dignity, tolerance. If you grow up with those values, you are going to be a different person than if you grow up in a culture where there's hate and distrust. So I think that's what makes people different. And again, nobody ever lives their lives with only nice people or bad people, but I believe in the human goodness and spirit.
And they ask, have you ever gone back to the camps?
Yes, I have. The one I visited at least 3 times is Mauthausen, because that's in Austria. And even though some pretty awful memories, it was, could just go again. Once you're liberated and given my life, I mean, it's like visiting another world. So I went there several times, but it took me almost 60 years to muster up the courage to go back to Auschwitz. And my wife Jen and I did that in 2006. And it was every bit as wrenching and emotional as I thought it would be.
Now this is an interesting question. If you were to sit down with a Nazi today, what would you say or ask him?
Oh, well, first of all, let's talk about how do I feel about Germans. The answer is, as I said in my talk, I'm a very strong believer in personal responsibility. You are responsible what you did, not what your ancestors did, or even your parents did. You don't have control over that. If you have the right values, you have the responsibility to act in a way that you are a human being and productive and basically lead a good life. Those who participated, knowingly participated in this process, I would never forgive. I'll tell you, just again, I don't know how much time we have left.
Well, we have about 5 minutes.
Okay.
Class.
Have you guys ever heard of something called Kristallnacht?
Yes, and that was one of the questions they wanted to ask.
Okay. What happened, this was in 1938, before the outbreak of World War II. But by that time, Hitler and the Nazis were in power, and anti-Semitism was just raging by then. They haven't started the concentration camps, prisons, yes, but not the gas chambers. And a young Jew in Paris, he, I think, came from Poland and harbored some strong feelings, assassinated a German diplomat. That was taken as an excuse by the Nazis to organize and carry out almost a countrywide, Germany-wide campaign of terror, destroying properties, burning down synagogues, beating and hurting people. That's what's called Kristallnacht, meant the night of breaking glass. And it's called that because all the smashed windows of synagogues and Jewish homes. Then, after that, and it did give Germany a black eye, it became, but then what did Hitler do? He said this crime was committed by the Jews and it started, and they owed Germany reparations. And I would like to talk to somebody who lived then and ask him how, after you destroyed and vandalized us, how can you possibly get your mind around to say that those people who vandalized and victimized are responsible? I'd just like to know, as a matter of plain logic. And so if I ever had somebody who went through it, I'd like them to explain. Now granted, of course, logic and reason didn't enter into this, hatred did, but how could people somehow get their mind around punishing the people whom they victimized, saying it was their fault. Well,
And I think you've actually answered all of the questions that the wonderful young people had asked you. Does anyone have a question before?
yes,
So on a, s-
you'll have to translate
Okay,
because I.
stand
Yeah.
up and be nice and loud here.
so on a similar note of what you were just speaking about, how do you react to Holocaust deniers?
Holocaust deniers, how do you react to
Uh,
Holocaust deniers?
I still have the feeling that anybody who has read, and not just read, seen what happened was there, for them to say it didn't happen is so silly that it just has nothing to do whether you're a good person or a bad person. Logic tells you they found the gas canisters that were used, you saw the buried bodies, and the fact that about 80% of the people never came back. So for people to say it never happened or it didn't happen and it was not as bad, to me is just so irrational that I just dismiss it as a kind of a silly notion. But unfortunately, as time goes by, people start, for various reasons, start saying this, and some people keep believing in it. And frankly, I'm hoping that our little talk today will give you a little insight of how to deal with this kind of a situation.
Thank you. Please.
Thanks very much. It was great talking to you and meeting you.